Hello everyone! In my last video, I talked about the 11 Incoterms as a spectrum regarding the responsibilities and the place where the cost and risk are delivered from the seller to the buyer. Today, I am going to talk about X risks, which is the first Incoterm in the spectrum, giving the least responsibility to the seller and the most responsibility to the buyer. I'm going to tell you what X risk is and what it's not, what advantages and disadvantages it has for both the seller and the buyer. If you have problems trading under X risks, this video is for you. So let's dive into it. X risks or X warehouse is one of the Incoterms used irrespective of the mode or modes of transport. It is when the seller places the goods at the disposal of the buyer at the seller's premises or at another named place. The seller must provide the goods and the commercial invoice in conformity with the contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity that may be required by the contract. That named place may or may not be the seller's premises. And for delivery to occur, the seller does not need to load goods on any collecting vehicle, nor does he need to clear the goods for export where such clearance is applicable. If no specific point has been agreed within the named place of delivery, and if there are several points available, the seller may select the point that best suits his purpose. The seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or within the agreed period. If the parties don't specify the exact place of delivery, in fact, it is as if they have left the choice of this place to the seller, so that the seller can choose the place that is best suited for this task. This means that you, the buyer, are exposed to the risk that the seller may choose a place that is ahead of where the goods are likely to be lost or damaged. Therefore, the best course of action for the buyer is to specify the exact point of delivery at the delivery location. If you find the kind of video helpful in your trading career, give it a like and remember to subscribe to the channel so that you can see the later videos as soon as they are published. Of all Incoterms, X risks places the least amount of risk on the seller, leaving the buyer with the majority of the responsibility. The seller has almost no responsibilities with X risks. The seller just packages the goods and prepares them for export. This often means placing the products in specialized packaging for export. The seller also makes sure that the buyer is able to pick up the goods from the location they agreed on, which is usually near the seller. The buyer has to pay to load the cargo onto a first carrier, deliver the cargo to the port or airport for shipping to their destination, respond to the costs of any export documentation, duties, taxes, and terminal fees, and pay the costs of loading the cargo onto the international shipping vehicle. In X risks, the buyer pays freight charges, insurance, destination terminal charges, final delivery costs, final unloading costs, and export, transit, and import clearance formalities required by the countries of export, transit, and import, like licenses, security clearance, pre-shipment inspection, any other official authorization, and duties, taxes, and customs. Remember that checking operation is different from inspection. The seller must pay the costs of those checking operations, such as checking quality, measuring, weighing, and counting, that are necessary for the purpose of delivering the goods. In the shipping process, and normally in Incoterms, there are two important points which may result in disputes. One is time. The exact time of delivery must be determined and agreed upon. The goods must be in the named place mentioned in the pro forma invoice at the right time mentioned in the shipping documents or the contract. The second point is the place. Remember to mention the exact location of delivering the goods after the Incoterm in your pro forma invoice or your contract. In EXW, the seller bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods until they have been delivered, and the buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the time they have been delivered. If the buyer fails to give notice, then the buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the agreed date or the end of the agreed period for delivery, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. Where applicable, the seller must assist the buyer at the buyer's request, cost, and risk in providing any document or information. If the seller cannot provide a document, he is not responsible for that, even if the buyer is unable to export that product without that document. The buyer must reimburse all costs and charges incurred by the seller in providing any information or documents. The seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of carriage. However, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost with any information in possession of the seller, including transport-related security requirements that the buyer needs for arranging carriage. If no information is mentioned on the documents or contract, the Incoterms is EXW by default. The seller has no obligation to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. However, the seller must provide the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk and cost with information in the possession of the seller that the buyer needs for obtaining insurance. The buyer has no obligation to the seller to make a contract of insurance. There are many advantages for buyers who use EXW, including the ability to save money. A seller can reduce shipping costs if they combine purchases from different sellers into one EXW shipment. Anonymity. Buyers who don't want to publicize who their seller is can change the name on their shipping documents so that the seller remains unknown. Discounts. EXW is often the cheapest method of shipping internationally. Because sellers pay little for EXW, they often transfer these savings to the buyer through discounts on the products. Export incentives. In some countries, for some products, the exporters get export incentives. VAT refund is sometimes part of the incentives. Access to sellers who don't ship. Since the buyers use their own shipping methods, they can still purchase from buyers who don't provide shipping. And finally, increased selection of products. EXW buyers can often find excellent products from sellers who only sell locally and don't want to ship internationally or sell to global markets. Buyers also may find cheaper prices from local markets and acquire these products using EXW terms. I have a note of caution to buyers. EXW is the Incoterm rule, which imposes the least set of obligations on the seller. From the buyer's perspective, therefore, the rule should be used with care for different reasons. One is for export clearance. When delivery happening, when the goods are at the buyer's disposal, either at the seller's premises or at another named point, typically within the same customs union, there is no obligation on the seller to organize export clearance or clearance within the third countries through which the goods pass in transit. In fact, exports may be suitable for domestic trades where there is no intention at all to export the goods. The seller's participation in export clearance is limited to providing assistance in obtaining such documents and information as the buyer may require for the purpose of exporting the goods. When the buyer intends to export the goods and where he anticipates difficulty in obtaining export clearance, the buyer would be better advised to choose the FCA rule, under which the obligation and cost of obtaining export clearance lies with the seller. The other point is loading risks. Delivery happens and risk transfers when the goods are placed not loaded at the buyer's disposal. However, risk of loss of or damage to the goods occurring while the loading operation is carried out by the seller might arguably lie with the buyer who has not physically participated in the loading. Given this possibility, it would be advisable where the seller is to load the goods for the parties to agree in advance who is to bear the risk of any loss of or damage to the goods during loading. This is a common situation simply because the seller is more likely to have the necessary loading equipment at his own premises, or because applicable safety or security rules prevent access to the seller's premises. Where the buyer is keen to avoid any risk during loading at the seller's premises, then the buyer ought to consider choosing FCA rule, under which if the goods are delivered at the seller's premises, the seller owes the buyer an obligation to load the goods on the first carrier.